Welcome to episode 2 of my entry for the Great Guitar Build-Off 2023. I wanted to start this episode by just showing the fretboard that finally arrived from Crimson. It's a piece of ebony, there's not really much more to say about it. So next up I thought we'd look at how I made the templates for the body. All three were made on the CNC in a similar fashion to this. Essentially there's two main toolpaths on these. One is doing the holes, and then the other is cutting out the various cavities and profiles. This was some of the first work I had actually done on the CNC, and overall it turned out really well. Of course it wasn't perfect and there were a few mistakes made, but those mistakes were not insurmountable and I've learnt from them for future use. So next up we're going to look at making the Sapele stripe, which will run down the centre at the top with a piece of quilted maple either side of it. This toolpath ran round the perimeter, cutting it down to a 70mm profile and squaring off all sides. And here you see me using my Radian Tools surfacing bit to thickness the piece. Here is the finished piece of Sapele next to the maple. The stripe ended up within 0.1mm of the target width and thickness, which, can't ask for better than that really. So here you can see me jointing the top. I used a combination of a plane, sanding beam, and actually ended up using a router on one of the pieces to get it a bit closer. And here you can see me gluing up the top. I decided to glue each side of the maple to the Sapele separately. I thought this would be a little bit easier, and in hindsight I think I was right. It was fiddly enough to come back and glue on the second side, let alone doing it all in one. So after gluing up that first side I clamped it up and put some weight on it for a couple of hours. Then I came back, took that off and glued up the other side, put it under clamps and wait again overnight that time. So here's the finished result. I'm very happy with how it's turned out. And here you can see me establishing a centre line on the Sapele stripe and then using my templates to draw on the body profile and see where I could fit the cavity plates. So as I mentioned in the first episode, I have not made a neck or a fretboard for a guitar before, and I've barely used the CNC before either. As such, I always intended to do several tests to get myself up to speed on the CNC, as well as try some of the processes that would be required to make the neck and fretboard. But as you can see, I wound up doing quite a lot of tests. I think the first test that I did was this partial fretboard that I showed in the last episode. Since then I have completed installing the epoxy inlays, I've cut the fret slots and I've done the radius. Overall the test was pretty successful. I've learned a few lessons and will apply those to the final fretboard. This was done mostly as a practice on CNC. Essentially, the idea was to cut out a replica of the cavity cover plate out of this 3mm ply, and I used that to test the fit with my templates. What I discovered is that I hadn't properly considered tolerances and fit, in that I used the exact same geometry for both the plate and the hole in the template, and as such they didn't fit properly. So I wound up adjusting the geometry of the plate slightly and redoing the test to make sure that it would fit. And I did the switch cavity cover plate there as well. Both plates fitted pretty well after this, but this tolerance and fit issue affected far more than just the cavity cover plates. For instance, the P90 pickup routes were affected by the same issue. As you can see, they fit upside down, but not the right way up. Fortunately, I already had a P90 template that I used for my telly build, so I used that to route the holes in the template slightly bigger. The reason I decided to do that is so that I don't forget and use the smaller holes. So another item I wanted to check was the fit of the neck pocket. So I decided to route the neck pocket into a piece of poplar I had lying around. I figured this would be a good approximation of what I would actually get, and I used the CNC to route out some test pieces of the heel and check the fit. The first one I did was using the same geometry, and it didn't fit at all well. Took a load of sanding to get it to fit, so I made some more with offsets inwards. First one being 0.1mm, and I think I did 0.15, 0.2, etc. So all of this testing led me to a few tweaks to the design. So if we start with the headstock, the first change I'd like to talk about is the transition from the headstock itself to the fretboard, where now I've introduced that curve up, sort of fender style, but instead of blending into the fretboard, it literally just meets the fretboard at a vertical plane. Another change you may have noticed is this stripe motif I've added to the headstock here. This is formed from pieces of maple and sapele binding, glued into a slot that is routed into the headstock itself. I decided to do another test to make sure that this would work, and at the same time I could test out all of the processes required on the CNC to make the headstock. So what you see here is the surfacing bit thicknessing the blank. This part here is for the headstock thickness, the previous one was for the overall thickness. Here I'm cutting out a profile around the headstock down to or just below the thickness of the actual headstock there. This helps with the next step, which is a 3D roughing tool path that clears out most of the material in that slope area. And this is a really clever operation that I learnt from Austin Shaner on YouTube. This trick allows me to use just a 1/4 inch flat end mill to create that slope using Fusion 360's 3D parallel toolpath. When running the tool in the longitudinal direction of the headstock, when that flat end mill meets the slope, the geometry involved means it ends up acting like a bullnose end mill. And here's the finished result once it's all cut out. And here it is after I've glued in the binding and shaped it roughly. Now this is only a very quick sanding and whatnot, but yeah, the effect is clearly going to work. And here I have installed the tuners just to get a feel for how they'll look. I really like the little pinstripes around the sides of those actually, which match the stripe on the headstock itself. But I have actually had to adjust the geometry because I noticed that the top tuner there on the lower side of the headstock is very close to the top. It just looked weird. So I've adjusted that in the CAD model here. Another area of the design that needed to be looked at was the truss rod and carbon fibre rod channels. I added more tolerance so that they would fit better, and also included this geometry you see at the ends here. This works by removing a little bit more material around the corner, so that the straight edges of the truss rod can fit in the slot with no modification required. As you've no doubt guessed, I wanted to test this out as well, so I used the CNC to route out the slots into this piece of pine or spruce or whatever. The first attempt that you see here was pretty good, apart from the fact that I messed up the geometry slightly so that the truss rod pokes out about 5 or 6 mil from the end. So I tweaked the CAD model again and roll on version 2, which is much improved and fits almost perfectly, with just a couple of minor little tweaks now for the final version. And that's it for episode 2. In episode 3 I plan to make the neck and the fretboard on the CNC. I plan to thickness the body. I will cut out the top and hopefully glue it to the body.